Some stakeholders in the higher education sector are criticizing President Cyril Ramaphosa for failing to address challenges in the sector. Students in most institutions of higher learning have been complaining about a perennial funding crisis and allegations of corruption within NSFAS. Joining us now is Asive Dlanjwa, national spokesperson of the South African Union of Students. Asive, very good afternoon and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Gwena, to you, your viewers and your listeners, and thank you for having us.
Let's start with just your reflection on whether the President touched on issues of students adequately.
In fact, we do think that the President could have probably touched a little bit more, especially as it pertains to what we believe some huge strides that have been made in the sector for the last few years. The reality is that as when we reflect now as a student organization generally, is that when we look at what was the funding of NSFAS, for instance, in 2016 at 12 billion rand and now sitting at 50 billion rand, we think that is a huge stride. Those are huge strides that have been made. The President could have reflected on that as the sixth administration's term comes to an end. Because I think we've almost tripled the amount of students that have been able to access higher education and ultimately able to graduate. The President, although maybe might not have had the time to go into details, but could have touched, for instance, on the high throughput rates throughout the sector, absolutely unprecedented. We have not seen them. But also he could have touched on some of the things that undermine that progress. For instance, the maladministration and the corruption that has been happening at NSFAS and other skills development entities in the country. I think the President should or could have spoken as to how do we strengthen, how do we fortify, and how do we guard against corruption undermining those efforts. Billions have been lost in the sector to corruption, etc., which undermines some of these goals which you are speaking about. So we think the President could have touched on those. Some of the things we think the President could have touched on, there's not necessarily, in fact, he had in the two previous State of the Nation addresses announced that we'll be building 2 new universities, which is absolutely critical for where we find ourselves as a country. Maybe the President could have spoken as a follow-up as to what are some of the steps. We know Cabinet has approved the building of those universities, but in terms of when can we see the commencement of the building of those institutions. So these are some of the things which we think the President could have maybe also reflected on.
Now, you touched on the issue of corruption, which is a big issue, particularly in terms of the issues of funding. But from your perspective, did the President touch enough on student issues that directly affect students? Like, for instance, now we're talking about the beginning of the year, and we know that the issues are always the same. And even from last year, year ending 2023, we saw issues of students not getting funding, NSFAS issues, and so such things. Do you think he touched directly, or is that where you felt there was a disconnect?
Probably a State of the Nation address would not necessarily be the platform to speak in detail of the challenges that are affecting the scheme and, for instance, issues of payment of allowances. But if he had to reflect on it, which we believe it could have, it would have been around a commitment from government to protect NSFAS as an entity and guard it against corruption and ensure that we are able to strengthen, fortify and bolster its capacity to service the poor and the working class. At that level, he could have given a commitment or spoken to. It would not have been the platform to speak to the allowances. Another issue that he could have spoken about, for instance, is that since, in fact, probably for the last 15 to 20 years, the student movement has been bemoaning, even before NSFAS, even before the household income bracket was increased from 120 to 350,000 per annum. There had been a huge cohort of students, which we call the missing middle, that have not been catered for since the democratic dispensation. For the first time, since about 2 months ago, a government would have announced a funding for the missing middle. That is another stride that we think the President could have reflected on. I know he did mention that they have increased funding in terms of student funding. But I think a specific and a special mention to the missing middle students who have been left in the cold and purgatory for many years, that in itself would have been a good reflection, and also to be able to galvanize the necessary confidence amongst particularly those students of the working class whom we call the missing middle. There has been absolutely no catering of the students from government for the last few years. So that is something else we think maybe the president could have reflected on as a positive strides that government has made as we reflect as we draw to an end of the sixth administration.
Just on that issue of the missing middle, Asive, if I may, I mean, an announcement was made. Your take on that, and as to whether that's exactly what you've been calling out for in terms of making funds available to the missing middle?
Look, we welcomed it, and we still welcome it, and we celebrate it greatly. As we have said, for many years there's been no solution or intervention for these students. We believe it is sufficient in the immediate. It is not necessarily sufficient, but it will cater to about 47% of all students in the missing middle. That's almost 50%. We welcome those interventions, obviously appreciating what would be the constraints in terms of a government deficit and the ability to be able to afford, etc. However, we welcome that. We believe we have made recommendations. We've also published them on how we believe it could be expanded and how we believe it could be made more accessible. So, except for those recommendations, on principle, it is a huge achievement for the student movement. We have been calling for it tirelessly for years. A funding solution for the missing middle. So we welcome it. We see it as a victory. But as we say, obviously, it still will not cater to about 53% of the missing middle with plan in its first phase, because it will be rolled out in about 3 broad phases, the second phase kicking from late this year. So as it rolls out, obviously, we want to see that expansion, but in principle, we think it is a huge stride and a huge victory for the student movement.
You touched and very passionately, I think even the last conversation that you and I have had on this conversation, we talk about the issues of NSFAS, and you touched on it just now as to what needs to be done, and particularly the issues of corruption. Are you confident that this is something that needs or that could be fixed? And if so, what does the president or government need to do to get NSFAS right?
It can definitely be fixed. It requires government will. It requires the president to appreciate the role, and generally government to appreciate the immense and the critical role that is played by NSFAS in terms of removing or giving a chance to the children of the poor and the working class to be able to pull themselves out of the clutches of poverty. If that realization happens, it is not difficult to deal with issues of NSFAS. The corruption is clear for everyone to see. The incompetence is clear for everyone to see. It does not require it, so it's not difficult. The president at his disposal, for instance, has the SIU, etc. These institutions must come in to bring about order at NSFAS. NSFAS must also begin to employ a credible and competent staff. As we are speaking right now, I can tell you, anyone who has visited NSFAS, by the way, including the minister and everyone, even if the president would go there, has come to the same conclusion that about 70% of staff at NSFAS are incompetent. They do not know what they are doing. You can call the call center yourself. You will hold for 3 hours as a matter of fact without getting assistance. So it's small things that just need to be dealt with. If we appreciate the role and the critical role that is played by NSFAS in terms of the broader developmental agenda of the country and what it means for us to be able to build a developmental state, then we will make the necessary interventions at NSFAS. They are not difficult. The minister has bemoaned it even himself many times that there are competence and staff issues at NSFAS, even the leadership of NSFAS, but no deliberate or aggressive steps have been taken to deal with that incompetence. We are, however, sitting with those people which even when you go there yourself, some of them you'll find them selling amaguinya inside the premises of NSFAS instead of assisting students. So we just need to deal with those little irritations, and we can be able to strengthen and consolidate the work that is being done to service the poor and the working class.
Asive, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for coming through to speak to us. Asive Dlanjwa, just reflecting on the President and his pronouncements on the issues of students.